So I remember a line that I heard in a sermon from a pastor a long time ago. When I heard it, it convicted me. And so, as pastors are prone to do, I thought later on, since it convicted me, I'm going to use it with other people so I can convict them. The line was kind of an interesting line. I'll give it to you here. Maybe some of you even heard it before. The pastor asked the question, so do you want to be happy or do you want to be holy? Do you want to be happy or do you want to be holy? And honestly, when I heard it, I thought, wow, that's convicting, because honestly, in my life, I want to be a little more happy than how desirous holy seems. And so I thought, again, since it kind of made me squirm a little bit, I could use it with other people. And I don't know if I've ever used it in a message here. Maybe I have. I know I've used it sitting across the table from people and thinking this is just the right moment to really convict somebody. And I'll look them in the eye and I'd say, so do you want to be happy or do you want to be holy? And every single time I've ever used that question, there is what I'll call the pastoral moment of pause, right? Where the person sitting across the table from me, they pause long enough that I know this is what's going on in their mind. They're thinking, I know what the right answer is to this question. I also know I'm not supposed to lie to my pastor, and my answer to the question isn't the right answer to the question, so what am I going to say now? All right? People who are most honest with me, most comfortable with me, if I would say to them, so do you want to be happy or do you want to be holy? They would look back at me and be like, like, why do I have to choose, right? And I think it's kind of interesting, because even when I throw the phrase out to you, I'm curious how it hits you. No doubt, a lot of it has to do with your definition of the word holy and your definition of the word happy, and people define those words all kinds of different ways. People define holy in different ways. We could go down the row. Everyone would have a different image of what that is. People definitely define happy in different ways. And even as I mentioned last week, when we're talking about what makes you happy, I kind of have what I think is the middle, the right definition of this. So it's not, I'm not asking, how do I feel happy every moment of every day? How do I get a hit? How do I push a button and get a feeling? That's not the happiness that I'm talking about. And I'm also not talking about the happiness that some Christians seem to think is right, which is basically misery in this life, but just waiting for heaven someday. I'm talking about a happiness that's ongoing, that overlays and underlies every part of your life. But what you might be a step ahead of me on right now is this idea that maybe happiness and holiness aren't actually in competition. Maybe. Maybe when you sang the song as a child, if you're happy and you know it, clap your hands, it was okay. The line wasn't supposed to be, if you're happy and you know it, repent. And if you start to have a healthy view of God, I think this helps you to see that maybe happiness and holiness aren't disconnected either, because, of course, a healthy view of God starts with the idea that God is your Father. And any of us who are parents, if I asked you, and if you're a good parent, said, so what do you want for your kids? Do you want them to honor you and make the right choices, maybe a simple definition of holiness? You'd say, yeah, I want them to honor me and make the right choices. And if you said, and do you want your kids to enjoy life? You'd probably say, yeah, I want my kids to enjoy life. And you might even think, you know what, those two, not only are they not opposed to each other, they might even be connected. That honoring God, honoring people who care for them, and making right choices might actually be connected to ongoing happiness. And so today, I just want to kind of begin with this idea that when we're talking about what makes you happy, this isn't in contrast to being godly. It is actually something I think God has rooted inside of us and wants us to be able to fulfill in the healthiest of ways. So last week, I started this teaching series. If you were here, I told you last week that I was going to come back to the first question I wanted you to answer. I made you repeat it after me. And the question, of course, is, what makes you happy? The answer is no thing or nothing. The happiness is always about a who, not a what. If you're going to have happiness in your life, it'll probably take a who or two. How about that for a little Dr. Seuss for you right there? Right? So we all know that happiness is not based in physical things, but instead in the relationships that we have. And the passage, I'll use kind of a shortened version of it tonight, that we rooted that in, came from Jesus, and get this, it was when Jesus was asked by someone, what's the most important commandment? This isn't like fifth on the list or 30th on the list. This is when Jesus says how to arrange your life. This is the most important commandment. And he says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. He said the second is like it. It's not disconnected from it. Love your neighbor as yourself. And so I described to you, I want to stay rooted in this because the rest of the message series is built on this, that happiness is defined by something. And let me give a little particular definition. Happiness is an ongoing peace with God, with self, and with others. So when Jesus says, love the Lord your God, love others, love yourself, that idea of love or peace or contentment, it essentially means we're good with each other. We're good with each other. And what you find is that if in your relational life with God, you could say to God, I'm good with God. If you don't feel like there's a disconnect, if you don't feel like there's a guilt that stands in the way or a shame that stands in the way, if you're good with God, that really matters in your life. And if you're good with yourself, because we all have a line somewhere in our lives where we'd say, if I did that, I just couldn't live with myself. And some of you live with this internal disconnect about your own identity. But if there's a contentment there, you love yourself in a healthy way. You say, I'm good with myself. You can be happy. And then, of course, that also has to do with being good in relationships with others. I've had more conversations about the line I said last week where I said, it's really hard to be happier than your most unhappy child. I've had so many conversations about this past week. Because if the people around you aren't good, if they're not happy, and if you're not good with them, it creates all kinds of gaps. Now, what I want to make sure we capture before we move on from this to the big picture for tonight is that there's a progression to this. This actually happens in an order. And I said this very quickly last week, but I've had so many conversations where I want people to see this. I want you to see that when you find your peace with God, that is a pathway to having peace with yourself. And when you have peace with yourself and with God, it allows you the chance to make peace with others. It really does work in that progression. So there's this peace, but remember, this is an ongoing peace. It overlays and underlies everything that we do. We acknowledge that this life can be a difficult life at times. This isn't about happy moments continuously. This is about walking through the ups and downs of life, and what happy people get to experience, because they have who's in their life, is that you get to take the highs in life, and those get accentuated and extended, and you get to take the lows in life, and because you have people around you, that gets mitigated and sometimes avoided, and then you have this kind of ongoing happy life. So, does God care about that? Well, interestingly, I want to introduce to you tonight a word in the Bible that I think if we captured its whole idea, it would shape the way we think about God and about life. The New Testament was written in the Greek language, and I had to take 3 years of it in seminary, so I'm going to use a little bit of it right now. We good with that? All right, so there's a Greek word, makarios. And this Greek word makarios has a very interesting definition. When you read it in your New Testament, it is almost always translated as the word blessed. Blessed. But when you kind of puff out the definition and say, what does this really mean? What's the idea behind the word? It's fair to look at it in this way, that it means blessed or happy or fortunate or favored. That's the whole idea behind this word. And actually, the prefix on the word has the idea behind it of an extended length of time, over a season or even a lifetime. And if you want to say, I feel blessed, what you're actually saying from that standpoint is that I have a life that I feel like has some fortune to it. It's good, it's happy, and it's lasting. It's not just moment by moment. Now, why is this word so important? Well, it's because tonight I'm going to give you a second principle of what it means to be happy, where happiness comes from, and it's all rooted actually in the central teaching of Jesus. So I want you to see this. Jesus really cares about this. When asked, what's the most important command, he gives us that. And then if you take his central teaching, it's what we call the Sermon on the Mount. Sometimes I'll refer to it as Jesus' Manifesto. We spent all summer on it in 2016. Jesus starts off his central teaching exploring this idea. So let me just set that up for you. This is the beginning of Matthew chapter 5. It says, "Now when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him, and he began to teach them." So you can picture the setting, right? I think I joked a couple summers ago, this would be nice for me. Like, in their day, the teacher sat down and everybody else stood up. That's what happened here. But interestingly, in this crowd, in this group of people, there are disciples and there's the crowd. And what you actually kind of anticipate, what you see by the time you get to the end of his message, is that Jesus started teaching his disciples, people who are already followers of his. But as he taught, the crowds kind of made their way because they were curious about what this wonderful teacher was saying. And so by the time he's done, the crowds are all there. And what I think is happening here is Jesus is giving them a message that is very healthy for anyone who's already devoted to him so that they can understand how to arrange their life. And it is also very curious because I don't know about you, but all the people there were followers of Jesus or not, were really interested in how to be happy. And so no matter where you are, whether you think of yourself as a disciple of Jesus, or whether you'd say, no, I'm just part of the crowd. I'm just kind of exploring this, figuring it out, seeing if I would trust this way of life. This is a message that Jesus designed for you. And he begins it by saying, blessed is. Now, when you walked in tonight, you were given not only your program, but another sheet of paper. I want you to grab it real quick. This sheet of paper says happiness is, and this has the 8 different statements that Jesus said about being blessed. What I'm going to do over the next few minutes is I'm going to drill down on 3 of these 8 statements because I don't have time for all 8. But all 8 are equally important, and I want you to take what I do maybe over the next 10 minutes or so with 3 of these statements and actually let you have it then as a tool so that you can do it with all of the statements, because what Jesus is describing here is that there is a way to find happiness. There is a way to find the blessed life. And it's not a secret, but it's also not intuitive. It's not a secret, but it's not intuitive. So you might be prone to arrange your life in a different way than this, but if you want a happy life, if you want what makes you happy, this is what you'll do. And so I'm going to kind of frame these 3 out in different ways, and I think you could take these home, and whether you do it all day tomorrow or whether you spend the next 8 weeks on this in your reflection, these things are what leads to blessing. So let me start with the first one that I've chosen. Blessed are the meek, happy are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Now, meek, if you've been around Suncrest, you may know this. It's one of my favorite concepts in all of the Bible. I think it's one of the most misunderstood. People perceive meek to mean weak, which isn't what it means at all. The whole image that gets attached to the word that means meek in the Bible is the idea of a stallion, a strong stallion, but who's bridled and under control. So it's a picture of strength under control. And one of the images I use for this all the time is I say, so imagine, you're a sales guy, you're out on the road selling, you're in the lobby, the bar, the hotel at the end of the day, and there's some other sales guys there, and you get kind of, comparing your life and your sales and all those things. And this is what's so fascinating to me. I see in situations like that, some people are prone to brag, right? I mean, you could have 4 guys sitting there. One could be doing $10 million in sales. Another could be doing $10 million in sales. One could be doing $1 million. Another could be doing $1 million. And what's so fascinating to me is how that kind of interaction goes when there might be people who have strength and have weakness at the setting, but also then how they present themselves. And one of the things that you're going to find in each one of these beatitudes, as they're called, is that there is kind of an extreme way of living, and that's what leads you to happiness. But we tend to either live in the middle or on the other extreme. So if you're following along in the outline, you see this kind of continuum that's drawn there. I'm going to fill in some words for you on these three continuums. You can fill them out if you want. Let's start with the idea of meek. So meek people are strong and humble. Strong and humble. Not necessarily a common combination, right? On the other end of the extreme, we all know people like this who are proud and weak. You're proud and weak. Like you don't even have something to show for yourself, but you act like you do. There's a lot of people who live in the middle, who when they become strong, they get proud, or when they know they're weak, they get humble. But the very picture of meekness, this characteristic, this identity piece, the path to happiness, Jesus says, is to carry yourself as strong and humble. Now, I don't want to make you uncomfortable, but whenever you meet somebody new, all of us kind of make judgments of people, based on different things. You have the handshake, you have the initial conversation. Some people make judgments based on physical appearance. I think I can honestly say to you, I don't do that. I don't judge people based on their physical appearance. Some people make judgments based on how much somebody makes or what. I don't do that. But if you want to know how I judge you when I meet you, this is the grid that I use. Within the first 60 seconds of meeting someone, I'm kind of sizing them up. I can't help it. And I'm asking, is this person strong and humble? Or are they a person who's weak and proud? Or are they a person who's strong and proud or humble and weak? Now, it's possible you're running through your mind right now. When's the first time I met Greg? And how did I present myself? If you're thinking that, you probably have a little pride in your life. Like you care about what other people think, maybe more than about who you are. But this is a beautiful quality that Jesus himself embodies. Strong but humble. And if you could nurture this in your character, Jesus says the meek will inherit the earth. The meek have a pathway to happiness, and you can imagine why. Out of all this category, which ones of this represent someone who's good with God, good with themselves, and good with others? They don't have to go around proving themselves. They don't have to go around bragging about themselves. They don't have to do that. They're content with who they are on the inside, and they can carry themselves that way, and they can just be humble about it. It's a beautiful picture, and meekness will lead to happiness. Let me look at a second one here. Second beatitude. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. You could stop and ask yourself right now, is that who I am? Am I a peacemaker? Well, living as a peacemaker is kind of an extreme way to live. There's lots of other choices for how to live. Let me put this continuum up on the screen. You could be a peacemaker, for someone who makes peace. You could be on the other end of the spectrum, a troublemaker, right? Or you could live in the middle and say, nah, I don't make nothing. I don't make nothing. I don't make trouble, but I don't really go about making peace either. And Jesus is starting to describe for us, there's a characteristic. It's kind of an extreme characteristic, but if you could live in it, then you would be like God. See, God himself is a reconciler. God himself is willing to walk into the mess of relationships and try to fight for and bring peace. He's willing to cost himself something in order to bring about a greater result. I can promise you that if you arrange your life that way, sometimes you will fail, but when you succeed and you see the work of God through you, you will carry on this happiness. Some of you know troublemakers. Some of you are sitting next to a troublemaker. Some of you are a troublemaker. I see this happen in relationships all the time. People will actually decide, if I'm not happy, nobody around me is going to be happy either. Where does it get us? Where does it get us? Some people decide to live in the middle. The useless middle. Say, I'm not going to ruffle any feathers, but I'm not going to work to have peace with others or bring about peace around me either. And Jesus says the path to happiness is peacemaking. That's what it is. Let me give you another one of the Beatitudes. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Nah, no doubt, you're doing what I'm doing. I'm like it. Blessed or happy and persecuted. Blessed and persecuted. How in the world do those two go together? Well, if you'll step back from it a second, what you'll come to the conclusion of is that Jesus is brilliant. Jesus is brilliant. He says, later on in this teaching, in this world that we live in, you will have trouble. That's the nature of this world. I describe creation and brokenness and redemption and restoration all the time, and we live in the broken season. And if you think you're going to make it through this life without experiencing suffering, then you're wrong. It's not going to happen. That is the nature of life in this world, that it is difficult, that it is broken, that we live in the midst of rebellion, and that the result is suffering for us. And what Jesus says is, so, you get to choose. And which one of these do you think would lead to happiness? You're either going to, on one end of the continuum, suffer for what's right, or you're going to suffer for your wrongs. You can put that up on the screen. You're going to suffer for what's right, or you're going to suffer for your wrongs. You get to choose. And I don't know about you, but I know a lot of people who have been through difficult circumstances where they stood up for the right thing and they paid a price for it. And it didn't generate the ongoing happy feeling that we're not aiming for. But it generated something inside them that said, but I could be at peace with God, I can be at peace with myself, and I can be at peace with others. And if the truth is that we're going to suffer certain things through this life, there are going to be valleys and difficult things to go through. You get to choose, Jesus says. You can suffer for what's right, or you can suffer for what's wrong. If you arrange your life in this extreme, where you say, you know what, I'll do so many things right that there will be some people who are wrong, who make me pay a price for it, that breeds happiness. Now, I just went through 3 of these relatively quickly. With every one of the others, I really pray and hope that you'll take some time and you can put them on the same continuum. I even phrased some phrases on that sheet for you so you could see it as this instead of that. But what's the point of all this? This is very important. What's the point of all this? What is the consistency that flows through this? What's the principle that's underneath of it? Well, this is the principle. Happiness is not immediately accessible. A happy feeling could be immediately accessible. You could go out to eat, enjoy the dinner, and feel happy because of the taste of the food or the environment that you are in. Then an hour later, you may or may not feel happy. I'm talking about a different kind of happiness, the kind that's ongoing, the kind that overlays or underlies all the other parts of your life. That kind of happy, what makes you happy, it is actually not immediately accessible. This is a picture of farming, not factories. A lot of you know that I grew up in a small town, a very small town in the middle of nowhere without a stoplight, and there's lots of stories and such to go about that. A few years ago, when my dad passed away, my family set up a scholarship in his name at the high school of my hometown. And so now every year in the springtime, there's seniors at that high school who write an essay for a scholarship and then gets awarded to them. And since our family funded it, we actually get to decide who gets the scholarship. When my mom was deciding, well, on what basis do we decide the scholarship, she decided that she would have all these students write an essay on the topic of the benefits of growing up in a small town. Now, this is so interesting to me because last week I read about a dozen essays of high school seniors who are applying for this scholarship. It's so interesting to read these. But my mom still lives in the small town. My older brother still lives in the small town. You know what the problem with Greg is? He moved to the big city. And I read these essays a little bit differently than they read them because these high school students, they love to take shots at the big city in the essay. And I just mark them up like crazy. I'm like, no, we shouldn't give it to that one. But it's caused me to step back and think a number of times to say, so what benefit did I receive from growing up in a small town that my kids aren't receiving because they're growing up in the suburbs? And out of all the things that were a benefit to me of growing up in a small town, I think it was what was placed inside of me as a young person to say, you plant in the spring and you don't harvest until the fall. There's a lot of work to be done in the spring. To work the ground and prepare it, drop the seed in the ground. You got to pay attention to it all season long. And you don't harvest. You don't get the result of it until the fall. And what Jesus is teaching us in the midst of this is that happiness is actually not immediately accessible. It's more a farm than a factory, and he had all the agricultural illustrations available to him, and he used them. And one of the big concepts of all the scriptures is about sowing and reaping, right? That what you do now may not give you what you want tomorrow. But if you do it now and tomorrow and the next day and the next day, and you start to arrange your life, your character, your attitude, in a certain way, your being, it will produce fruit later on. My friends, I don't know a more important principle to teach you about how you will find happiness than to encourage you to step back from your life right now and understand there is not a button I can push today to bring me happiness tomorrow. There's no button like that. Instead, according to the scriptures, God has arranged this world and he has designed you in such a way that if you sow something into your character, then you can reap it. So what makes you happy? Sowing. Now, this is totally goofy, okay? All right, let's think back. We now have two answers to this question, right? The first one from last week and that I had you repeat earlier tonight. Help me out, see if you can get it. What makes you happy from earlier? Nothing. And what makes you happy? Sowing. They kind of rhyme, don't they? Okay, maybe not. What makes you happy? No thing. It's always about a who, not a what. What makes you happy? Well, sowing. Because happiness actually isn't immediately accessible. You have to invest in something and take time. Before I close today, let me read to you the closing words of Jesus to this Sermon on the Mount, this manifesto of his, and understand what he's teaching us about the path to happiness. He teaches all these things about how to arrange your life, and then he comes to the conclusion, and this is what he says. He says, therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. This is huge. Everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice. That's like someone who goes out and builds a house, which takes a long time actually, and chooses to build it over here in this extreme. The extreme of meekness, the extreme of peacemaking, the extreme of persecution, to suffer for what's right instead of what's wrong. You build your house over there, and here's what happens. When the rains come down, the streams rise, and the winds blow, because that is the beating we all take in life, it will not fall because you built your house on the rock. Jesus said there's another type of person. He says, I know it. I'm talking to disciples and crowds. And some of you are hearing me, and some of you are enjoying this, and some of you are saying, that's really smart, but you're not actually going to do it. And here's what he says about that. He says, but everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who said, well, here's the easiest place to build. We'll just put it on the sand. And of course, then when life beats you up, the pain isn't mitigated. The pain isn't avoided. The pain is there. My friends, this is so important. Many, many people will hear the teaching of Jesus. Many, many people will walk into church and hear a good sermon, and when they walk out, they think they got it. Because what they think they got is they got credit. Call mom. Hey, mom, I went to church this week. You might even feel something inside of you. Say, that's new. That's neat. That's wise. I like it. But liking it and not doing it is completely useless. To walk out of here and say, oh, that strong and humble thing, I agree with that. I agree that's a good idea. But I don't actually start sowing it into my life. It means that what you're sowing in the spring is what you will reap in the fall. Because this is about sowing and reaping. And one of the hardest things when I have a conversation about happiness with people is to have an appreciation that I'm going to have to nurture some things in my life over time so that I'll experience happiness later. Where does happiness come from? From no thing. It's always about a who, not a what. And from sowing. Putting these practices and habits, constructing our lives in that way so that later on we'll have the type of character that experiences happiness. I'm going to pray for you to explore that this week. God, thanks for your goodness to us. Thanks for your wisdom to us. God, one of my prayers today is that these 3 ideas that we just drilled down on a little bit would be ideas that everyone in this room would drill down on a lot. They would talk with people they trust about them. They'd ask honest questions to say, is this part of my life? They'd take these 3 and the other 5 and God spend the next weeks, if not months, thinking, how can I arrange my life to find this happiness? And God, I pray that you grant us a strength and a patience and endurance through that process that helps us to wait and then bears the fruit that you promise. I pray this in Jesus' name.